Thanks for coming today. Rio, come on and take a seat. So most of you know me. I'm John Banks. I teach here at the ERE program. Thank you for coming today. This is Doug Faulkner. I'll let Doug introduce himself and give a little bit of his background. But we met fortuitously at a ERE-sponsored conference back in October. We had a SAIS alum come and speak about the IEA's launch of their midterm renewable energy report, and Doug was hunting for on. And Doug introduced himself after that, and we subsequently talked and thought it would be a great idea to have Doug come and talk about bioenergy, because I think we both recognize that's perhaps not a subject that's discussed enough at SAIS and the ERE, so we thought this would be a good opportunity to have someone, including a SAIS alum, who's been working in bioenergy, to give a little talk and open up for some dialogue and some questions, and give students some exposure to this really important topic. So, thanks for coming today. Appreciate you having you.
Thanks for coming.
The floor is yours.
Great day. I have to smile a little bit because early in the Obama years, I was giving a talk out in California, and much to everybody's surprise, the moderator said, "Just introduce yourself." And so everybody had their own take on that, but I thought I'd be funny and stood up and said, well, I'm the other basketball playing, green energy loving boy from Illinois. And that got a lot of laughs, but because I'm kind of a born smart aleck, I guess, I didn't know when to stop, and I added, but I really am from the party of Lincoln. I got no laughs. And so, you have to know your audience and know your punchline. But yeah, I graduated from here in 1979, was recruited right out of SAIS to go to the Central Intelligence Agency. I was a China hand, spent a good number of years in the intelligence community, loved it. Watching Chinese foreign policy, and that was the time period you probably remember right when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, so there was a lot of stuff going on between China and the US and the Soviet Union. I eventually ended up in policy, switched over into policy, working with in the George H.W. Bush administration with the Secretary of Energy then, Admiral Watkins. Never went back to intelligence, but I got more involved in science and technology. And as part of that, I kind of drifted into green energy. And back then, that was that time period. And then once he left, I was still a civil servant, and I drifted into bioenergy. Back then, you may or may not be surprised, the Department of Energy and the Department of Agriculture lived right across the street from each other. They didn't talk to each other. And so I was walking across the street and building ties with my brethren at USDA and getting to know that, and then helping to build some new partnerships. And the Bill Clinton administration, he was emphasizing bio-based products, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And I helped them have to build a program, an R&D program, and then when W. Bush came in, I kind of came out of the closet as a conservative Republican and became a political appointee. So that's an unusual kind of twisty-turny career, even for Washington. China hand to green energy person, civil servant to political appointee. And then great time running big offices at energy and agriculture, multi-billion-dollar R&D organizations. And when Mr. Obama came in, he swore the oath of office. We were all fired. So that's the way it is, live by the sword. And I started my own company, Leatherstocking LLC. So that's been about 10 years now, finding clients and helping them navigate government and find government money, helping them with strategic planning and corporate communications. So I kind of started my career in green energy and bioenergy, and it's been a passion of mine. I've been involved in a lot of other things too, the other parts of green energy and energy efficiency. I've been in them all. But this is an area that I keep coming back to, and it's intellectually very stimulating for me. And I'll get into that too. I've been sort of taken, you might know, the Washington Post once in a while on the weekend runs an article, so many myths about whatever, Social Security or you name it. So I've been kind of toying around with an article myself because I do write for publication. So I just thought today, this is a huge topic area. We only have an hour or so. But I wanted to make it interesting and stimulate maybe controversy, because that can always come out of this topic. but also questions. So I thought I'd just lay it out as the 10 myths about bioenergy. And if you don't mind, I'll just get right into it. And it's really, I'll kind of skim the surface on a very big topic area. And feel free at the end to, take me on or ask questions. There's no stupid questions and there's no thin skin on the speaker's part. All right, first myth, bioenergy is just a gasoline additive for cars. Yes, in the aftermath of the 1970s oil shocks, corn ethanol became a focus of U.S. energy policy. It was a big success, it still is. It's at its maximum of 15 billion gallons and they export a lot. And Brazil's generals in the 1970s began promoting sugarcane ethanol, big success, although it kind of has had its off-ramp problems. But now it's much bigger than that globally. It's drop-in fuels versus blends like ethanol, advanced diesel versus soybean biodiesel, bio-based chemicals for consumer products, everything from plastics, paints, adhesives, lubes, cosmetics, food additives versus the ubiquitous petrol-based products that really touch every aspect of our lives, and most people don't understand that. Wood pellets for co-firing with coal or alone for power and heat, decentralized biorefineries all over rural America or rural communities versus oil refineries on the coast. There's kind of a Back to the Future twist to this. You may or may not remember that movie, but Henry Ford had a dream of growing an American car and fueling an American car with soybeans. That was overtaken by the flood of oil coming in, cheap oil, but that dream's now coming back full circle. Second myth, bioenergy is just an American Midwest farm thing. Sometimes you can't take the boy out of the country. Yes, it's very important to the farm economy in the I-states, Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, the corn growers, but it's a global business and growing. U.S., Brazil, and European Union are the biggest makers and users of biofuels in the world, but the Indians and the Chinese companies are coming on very strong. They're going to be big competitors. Southeast Asia and Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, are target markets for growth in biofuels in particular. The developed world is racing to take the lead in the next generation of fuel for planes and ships. That's the big edge, competitive edge, as well as bio-based products. For example, there was a 2-page article on me and my emphasis on woody bioenergy in Sweden's largest business paper a week or two ago. Huge interest in the Nordic areas, partly because of all their trees. Bioenergy is just another corn product. Yes, corn and sugar cane are the biggest sources of feedstock now, and they're very competitive, very cheap, but many other raw material competitors are rising fast. Trees are the main source for new liquid fuels for planes and ships, the distillates that they need. Algae, including seaweed and kelp, are in all forms are under strong consideration. There's kind of a micro industry growing there. Even carbon coming out of waste gas fumes from steel mills now there's a company producing fuels and chemicals from that named Lancetec. Plus agricultural waste from so many crops in so many places, and especially the developing world. Bioenergy is just another green energy. No other source, I contend, no other green energy source of energy is as complex as bioenergy. You take it from the growers in the field to the handling of the products to the manufacturing to the end use. It cuts across so many markets and scientific disciplines: energy, agriculture, forestry, transport, chemical, complicated private-public partnerships and supply chains, interlocking political, diplomatic, scientific, social, economic, and environmental factors. It's important to both the civilian and the military sectors. It not only addresses climate change, but also the huge issue of petroplastic waste in the oceans and food chains. In the US, we've had a series of seminal pieces of legislation: the Renewable Fuel Standard twice, the Farm Bill every few years with its special authorities and funding, and the Bipartisan Biomass R&D Act of 2000, what the government calls a Bible for bioenergy, is still in effect, and I helped implement that. Congressionally mandated national initiative comes out of that. That's the only green energy that has a national initiative per se. They have a federal coordinating board led by Energy and Agriculture and an advisory committee which I was appointed to lead last year. Globally, you have the IEA. He mentioned that they came in. They're big bioenergy boosters. The Food and Agriculture Organizations, Global Bioenergy Partnership, what the bureaucracy is called GBEP, and the UN Secure Energy for All effort. So it's on many different levels. Experts around the world are pushing bioenergy. Another myth. Bioenergy is yesterday's technology. You kind of have a mental image of Farmer Joe on a tractor in the back 40. But in the US, the public, the media, and the politicians, their views are all stuck in the past, maybe decades ago, and colored by the big political fights in Washington, largely between big ag and big oil. But that really isn't this. But virtually every day, news is coming out about fast-moving technological change. I'm astounded by it. That's one of the reasons I still love it after 20 years. They had a vision in the 1990s of a marriage between biotech and computer tech, using the language of so many decades ago, and that's starting to take place. There's incredible breakthroughs in biotechnology. From the new ways to process raw materials like enzymes and insect guts, to new uses, using trees to make clothing. I think there's a royal family in Scandinavia modeling those. To new market breakthroughs, substituting fuels for polluting ocean-going cargo ships. So we have new companies and new places with new products all over the place, and customers, especially young consumers, clamoring for more. This new technology is heating up competition between electrons, gases, and liquids for ground transport fuel. By that I mean electric vehicles, hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, and biofuels. And some people think that competition's over, but it's not. It's going to continue on for a while. Bioenergy is bad for food production, healthy forests, and rural communities. Back when I was really in the heyday of this, we had an old bugaboo called the food versus fuel argument. I found it especially maddening. We think eventually put to bed, where there were people arguing that if you use plant material to make fuel, you were really taking food out of the mouth of starving people. That just had no factual basis, but it hung around for a while. But it's really food plus fuel plus fiber plus feed for animals to modernize agriculture for the billions of more people coming on our earth that are going to need more food and a better life. So we're giving farmers new markets, especially in the developing world. For decades in the US, there have been many strictures against using forest materials, against kind of cleaning out the undergrowth. But these horrible forest fires out in California in particular, beetle infestations wiping out giant forests in the southeast and south, that's changing the views. And in fact, one of the odd things, one of the things I love about this is the odd bedfellows that pop up. We have President Trump and California Governor Newsom are on the same page. You can't get more different than that. But they're both issuing executive orders saying we need healthier forests, we need to use forest materials wisely to cut down on forest fires. That's a huge change. And Governor Newsom's taking a lot of flack from his own party, his own supporters. Political sustainability, something I talk about a lot, and we can talk about it in questions and answers, but it's just as important as social, economic, and environmental sustainability to me. If you don't have the political support behind it, it just won't last. So I think bioenergy can help to reinvigorate impoverished rural communities. That's a big theme of mine. Bioenergy is bad for the environment. That's a myth. Yes, there are some bad things from early stage biofuels. There's been epoxy in the Gulf where the stuff draining down the Mississippi River, jungle deforestation in Brazil and Southeast Asia. And there's continued publicity, always, never stops, for debunked theories. But on balance, I contend bioenergy is demonstrably sustainable and better than fossil fuels. I think it can't be argued, but maybe we can. It's really filling the gap for climate change and the very long transition that I see to electric vehicles. You can't just sort of ignore it and say we have nothing in between the period it's going to take for electric vehicles to become more and more prevalent. It counters the reality of oil's continued dominance globally and of the many trade-offs in energy. And we can talk about this too. It's one of the themes that I talk about in public, but there's no perfect energy source. no perfect energy source. There's always a trade-off. And we can go into all kinds of examples of that. Bioenergy is irrelevant to a Green New Deal. The recent GND contained not one word on bioenergy. I wrote an article for a publication that they gave me the moniker of the Clean Tech Conservative. I wrote it recently called Green for the Common Man, and argued instead to include bioenergy in the Green New Deal and more focus on markets, less on government, and more on the rural renaissance. I think it's worth pondering why the far left left it far out. Bioenergy is irrelevant for new global politics. Yes, it's irrelevant if oil is irrelevant and great power conflict is obsolete, but oil is still king and will be for a while, and it still needs ocean transport to get it where it's going. So it's again back to the future kind of where navies are important again to protect shipping lanes and clear the choke points for America and its allies. Think the Straits of Malacca or the Straits of Hormuz or you name it. Energy and water are clear flashpoints for global strife as well as potential strangleholds on modernization for the developing world. And finally, biofuels are a great insurance policy against oil market disruptions, which are coming. You can see, the sanctions against Iran, the sanctions against Venezuela, other things that could disrupt oil markets like that. Finally, bioenergy is irrelevant to SAIS students. Yes, it's irrelevant if you want to ignore unprecedented transitions in energy and the environment and the exhortations. Yes, it's still early stage, but global job opportunities abound on the horizon and are going to grow, do nothing but grow over the coming decades. You've got companies of all stripes in many places, trade associations, aid and advocacy groups, international agencies, finance, investors, government, media, they all need help from the kind of skills the SAIS gives you, the kind of training, the global kind of perspective. If you need more info on this, and we can get into this a little bit more, you can follow me on LinkedIn or my LLC website. I have my technical advisory committee meetings are largely public. There's one tomorrow out in Virginia, Northern Virginia. You can observe big conferences like the Advanced Biofuels Leadership Conference. It's the best one in America. Next week in DC, I think they offer free attendance for students. I can help with that. I'm always glad to help a SAIS student, and I'd be particularly glad to help somebody in this area. So thank you for listening. I hope I stirred some things up. Let's just dig in.
Great, yeah, no, thank you, that was.
And it's kind of a whirlwind to the horizon.
I think you ended with a bang, with a big interest among students in terms of their careers, but we'll come back to that.
Okay.
But I'm going to just use the power of the convener or moderator to just ask the first question. So I was really interested to hear about some of the, for lack of a better phrase, so I don't know how you phrase it, more modern applications in plastic, in clothing, in other things. Can you talk a little bit more about that in terms of the applications of bioenergy to some of these new industries and startups that you see, and so maybe that links in with some of the career opportunity parts of this, but I'm kind of
well, I was hoping it did.
I'm interested in those sort of newer applications in particular.
Well, I guess as I was going through here, I hope you were picking up on the terminology gets a little tricky sometimes. I refer to bioenergy as covering transportation fuels, electricity, heat, and all this chemical stuff. Chemicals are used as precursors to make all kinds of things. Most people have no idea about the prevalence of oil, petroleum in our daily life. It touches us in every way you can imagine. The stuff, it's materials, it's, as I went down the list, plastics are a big one. That's predominantly made out of, overwhelmingly made out of petroleum. And we have a massive, almost, you can't even overstate the issue how bad it is, especially coming down the rivers of Asia and Africa. It's filling the oceans and it's getting in our food chain. People are just starting to wake up to that. So any kind of plastic you can imagine is made from oil, and that industry, petrochemical industry, is growing by leaps and bounds. This is only just starting, and there's competition. I just read the other day that they're starting to think about using coal from Appalachia as another competitor. So it's another fossil fuel. Coal's cheap. They can't figure out how to burn it anymore, so they might be using that. You know, it's, I never quit being astounded by the applications that you can use plant material for. I mean, I remember I very gently told my wife about a lot of the cosmetics she was using are based on petroleum. That's interesting. And there are people who are sort of trying to find new pathways there. You have to be cost competitive. It's a very, very competitive situation. You can't just do it based on the label, or they sell that brand. So it's paints, adhesives, anything you might, lubes for your cars, just about anything in modern life comes from petroleum, not just the fuels for our cars. And so, we have recycling issues, but this is, it's growing. I read about a company the other day that is making a bio-based chemical you can spray on roads, so it won't, when it degrades, it won't harm the environment as opposed to salt or whatever else they might use. So there's just, the innovation is stunning in this field. I mean, you could, I read every day. I read about new companies, new techniques, new marketing, that kind of thing.
Okay.
And it's mostly in the developed world, mostly Europe, mostly in America. But I think is that it has to spread, and they will be putting up manufacturing plants elsewhere. So when I use this terminology, bioenergy, sort of the overriding thing. Then biofuels, which I refer to as liquid transportation fuels. Bioproducts is this using plants to make chemicals, which are then used to make you name it. And sometimes biopower for electricity. We have this massive industry that's grown up in the southeast of the U.S. where they harvest trees, make them into pellets. People have made enormous amounts of money, ship it off to Europe because of regulations on climate change, and they burn those wood pellets with coal or by itself. Nobody asked my opinion, of course, but I think that's kind of stupid use of trees. But that's how unsustainable it is to cut that stuff down, turn it into pellets, and ship it. This kind of river of shipping back and forth of wood pellets. But in any event, so it's a fast growing field, and it gets very confusing. You can imagine, I had to spend some time discussing it with policymakers. I got a lot of stories, but I remember one time I was called up to the Hill to brief a very prominent U.S. senator who was probably one of the most knowledgeable about bioenergy stuff. And I was going through my little spiel, and he was nodding his head, and I mentioned about bio-based products. He stopped me. What are you talking about? And we kind of went down, started explaining that. They didn't know about it. And that was 10 years ago, but still, the amount of, let me put this in a more generous way. The lack of good coverage, knowledgeable coverage in the press is pretty stunning, and it gets very confusing. Some people talk about windmills taking the place of oil and transportation. Well, sort of, if you've got enough electric vehicles, but it really is two separate worlds. Electricity generation and liquid transportation fuels are two very, very different worlds that have their own kind of history and politics involved. So the terminology trips you up a little bit, but that's kind of how I phrase it. Most people phrase it that way.
Well, that's interesting. No, and I can't speak for everybody. But I think the bioproduct side of things is certainly something that the average person doesn't think about, and obviously the policymakers aren't aware of it.
Well, it's still a very small. When you're competing against big oil, which has, they have trillions of dollars in sunk cost in factories. Like we're talking about going to factories.
Yeah.
Go to a petrochemical plant, and so it's a hard climb, but they are making headway. And when I was in the Clinton administration, I was asked to start up a new R&D program in bio-based products. There was not one in the U.S. government. So this was in the last few years of the Clinton administration, and we thought then we had visioning sessions and strategic planning. By the way, I brought, if you're at all interested, I brought kind of just part of my library of documents that have come up over the years from the U.S. government and the IEA, road mapping to IEA, National Biofuels Action Plan that I ushered that through in the tail end of the Bush administration, vision, road mapping on bio-based products. So we thought back in that time period that bio-based products were just going to explode on the scene. It didn't happen. And so it kind of ebbs and flows. It's coming back now. But I think largely driven by climate change, largely driven by consumer interest. Young consumers especially are wanting different kinds of products. And they're kind of entranced by the branding of trees to clothes kind of thing.
Questions?
Sir.
Hey, thanks for the presentation. I'm interested in learning more about the role of biofuels in electricity generation, particularly as it relates to peaking plants, and kind of putting this all in context with the natural gas boom that's occurred in this country in the last.
Natural gas is a big competitor too. When I spoke about electrons, gases, and liquids in transportation, natural gas has got they have a prominent place in certain sectors. You see buses running on LNG or natural gas. Well, I kind of downplay the biopower part. And what you're talking about, the liquid, I think you were saying, the liquid fuels to power, there's very little of that.
Bioenergy broadly.
Yeah, okay. Well, I'm terrible with numbers, so I can't remember the statistics. I remember big and small, and but there are certain parts of the country, maybe the Northeast, where they burn wood because they have a lot of it for heat and power. You have certain sectors of the economy, like the pulp and paper industry, which has been hit so hard in the last few years by change. They're kind of a biorefinery in the sense where they would use wood to make products, and they burn waste to make power and heat. I mentioned the wood pellets, especially. We don't do a lot of that here in the U.S., but Europe, especially like the UK, it's really big in terms of reducing the use of coal. So it's there've been I've witnessed efforts over the years, like hog farms in particular, like down in North Carolina, where they have these big waste ponds of manure, and people have been harvesting, dairy farms have been harvesting manure, harvesting the methane coming off of manure. That's a type of natural gas that competes against natural gas. They can use that to burn for electricity. But it's in my mind, the power sector is not as big of a factor for bioenergy. It's there, but just like energy in general, it's a very complicated situation. Very regional, very sectoral. Certain companies may do it. Certain parts of the country where they have a lot of trees, they may do it. And that's basically, by the way, what is used to make electricity, apart from methane. The animal waste trees, and people are that industry is starting to rethink that and get more into bio-based products and biofuels. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, sir. And I actually have 3 questions.
Okay.
Yeah, just let me ask
Only
the first
3.
Yeah, ask the 3 of them. So first, I think one of the reasons why I see bioenergy is irreplaceable among all the competing renewable resources is that for now, bioenergy is the only way to transform the waste to the energy. And the IDA folks are trying to apply this bioenergy in developing countries. The reason why they want to do it is because reduce cost. But now it seems like the failures are much more than successful.
There's been a lot of failures.
Yeah. And then just didn't achieve that. So do you see that bioenergy is still a luxury good that can only be used in developed countries, and it's very hard to implement it in developing countries? That's my first question. And the second one is that I had a professor that has like 20 years experience in renewable energy project finance, and he said if I can only give you one advice from an investor perspective, is that never touch bioenergy. If you have
A lot of people got burned.
Yeah, if you just want to lose all of your money. So I know it's challenging. From your perspective, how do you think that, how do you convince investors to invest in bioenergy? How do you let them get on board? And the third one is that you mentioned a lot about the bioenergy applications in the electric vehicle field. And why do you think that bioenergy is better than all the other renewable energy sources? And I think that's all my questions.
Okay. I was writing them down in shorthand here. Just bear with me while I write the third one down. Bioenergy is a luxury. That's a really interesting question. I'll come at that a couple of different ways. One of the, another short story, I was asked to lead a U.S. government delegation at the end of the Bush administration down to Brazil. President George W. Bush and President Lula of Brazil were forming this, again, kind of odd bedfellows partnership. George Bush was a right-wing scion of an oil family. Lula was a left-wing rabble-rouser who had his start in the sugarcane fields. He had lost a couple or three fingers as a boy. You know, they used machetes out there in sugarcane fields. So I've seen tapes of him, and I actually saw him in person. Will get up on the stage and wave his mangled hand, and talk about the issues there. But Brazil was holding because they were our partner and they were really big on biofuels, holding an international conference. So we took a delegation down with the agriculture secretary, and I was there with him. And there were countries represented from all over the world: Europe, Africa, Central America, the Caribbean. And it was one of the most remarkable experiences, political experiences of my career. The diplomats, U.S. diplomats cautioned us, and they said, man, every time we go to one of these kind of meetings, they just whip the daylights out of the U.S. And for all kinds of reasons, criticizing us. So we were prepared for that. But we get down there, and the European delegates, largely it was Northern European, England, Netherlands, Germany, were just wailing on bioenergy. And Lula had his whole cabinet up on the stage. It was, we didn't expect that. To emphasize the importance of Brazil, we had a cabinet secretary, and the Europeans were just using all kinds of inflammatory language that you may or may not be familiar with, but they talk about raping the Amazon, raping the Gulf of Mexico, that kind of language, incendiary language, and just saying that how bad bioenergy was. But the most remarkable part was not that, we expected that, but one by one, the leaders of African and Central American countries that Asia was lightly represented stood up and started wagging their fingers at the Europeans and saying, you're not going to screw us again. This is neo-colonialism. You stopped us with your GMO focus, you stopped us from developing agriculture. We really want bioenergy. It can help improve the development of our agricultural sector and thus our country, because we're so heavily dependent on food and oil, and we think we stand with Brazil and the US. And our diplomats were open-mouthed, and I read the unclassified cable coming out. They said it was the first time ever that we had stood, US, Brazil, and the nations of color stood together, and it just, one by one, they stood up and just wagged their fingers and said, this is neo-colonialism. We think this is very important to us. And they've never really changed that. It's kind of gone up and down. But that's just a little vignette about how odd the politics can be sometimes. So I don't think it is a luxury. Clearly, though, if you think about sustainability and the Global Bioenergy Partnership developed indices and matrices. They look at economic sustainability, which means a business has to be sustainable. You can't just do it on aid. It has to be socially sustainable. It has to fit in with the social structure. And there's a lot of issues about that in Africa. And it has to be environmentally sustainable, and all the facets of that, not just one piece of it. So I think I developed a class for a small set of colleges on looking at bioenergy in Africa, and it's very complex. You have to look at their food and oil demand. When these countries, most of them who have to import a lot of both, if they get in a jam, it hurts their economies very badly. So it's sugarcane ethanol is very cheap, really. You have to develop, though, it isn't just as easy as going in and putting in a plant. You have to have the infrastructure. These places don't have highways, don't have, you know, the railroads and the ports, and they don't have the chemical background or the intellectual infrastructure, you know, people trained to do it. So I guess I come at it a little different way, but I know that there are major global players in India and China that are pursuing this, not only for their own countries, but they're taking on the big boys in the U.S., Brazil, and Europe. They see markets out there. Don't touch bioenergy. I'm not sure, I wrote that down. I'm not sure what that question was now. The second question.
Yeah, the investors.
Oh, yeah, right. Yeah, so, you know, it's kind of funny about investors, you know, very, very smart people. I've never met a dumb one. But they kind of, sometimes they can go in herds, and there can kind of be, you know, a lemming-like thinking on things. And so in the Bush administration, the president made it a national priority. He talked about bioenergy in his State of the Union address and got a lot of play in the press, and a lot of people kind of ran out and were throwing money at it, lots of big money. And there were a lot of failures. And they pulled back. And it's the amazing thing to me, I tell CEOs that I run into, I don't know how you guys do your job, because, you know, the money is hard to come by, government's hard to work with, you got all these things you got to deal with, and you're still plugging away. So I think it's just like anything else. So if a company is a good company, and you can kind of dig in and see, do they have their feedstocks lined up? Does that make sense? Do they have the smarts to run a processing plant? Do they have a pathway to sell their products? Can they do it competitively, or, you know, depending on, lots of people are selling into California because they have a special low carbon fuel standard premium. So investors will come with their deals, and I think this is still growing. You know, it's hard to say. It's not a straight shot like anything in energy, but I think, and I've talked to investors. This conference next week, I mentioned there are a lot of investors there. They always come. Yeah, they're a little bit tight-fisted, but there is money there, and there's money globally because they see things like the need to have a different options to petroplastic. You know, that's becoming such a monster issue. Why bioenergy in transportation? Well, this kind of gets to, this may be one of the most sensitive things I talk about here today, but I know that politically there are people that, like in the Obama administration, he advocated certain goals for electric vehicles. That's laudable, that's every president sets goals like that, but I'm just not a believer in that electric vehicles are going to make an impact anytime soon. It's a very tiny slice of our vehicle market here in America. It's much bigger in certain parts of Europe where they may be mandating that. It takes 15 to 16 years for a vehicle to turn over in the American fleet before you get rid of it. And there are more and more vehicles being bought. There are trucks, you know, SUVs. So it's a very steep climb, and especially if they start to do away with some of the subsidies, which I pejoratively call it for rich white folks on the coast, for electric vehicles, and that's becoming more costly by the minute. So I think that's why I think that, you know, it'll take place in different places at different speeds. The developing world, they're way away from an impact on electric vehicles, and they need a way to break the hold of petroleum. So again, you have to kind of break it down. It's hard to make generalizations, but even here in the States, I think if you really are serious about climate change, and it sounds kind of counterintuitive, but you have to promote biofuels. There's no way to get from here to there to a fully electric world. You can't just let the carbon emissions continue to grow. Biofuels can cut down on that. And it, again, you know, taking the discrete pieces of it, the ocean shipping industry is proposing new rules that will really greatly reduce the amount of, you know, sludge oil that they use in their engines, because they've been very concerned about their impact on the environment. There's no way they're going to have these big ocean ships powered by electric engines. They have to go to something like biofuels, they know it, or more efficient engines. So the airline industry, you're not going to see electric 747s, or hopefully not. they're desperately trying to find alternatives to petrol fuel. So those two industries alone are driving change. It's still very small, but that's a slice of the barrel. If you take a barrel of oil and crack it into gasoline, naphtha, kerosene, all these things, distillates, that's something that is a lot of people are looking at. But to your point about investors, there are only 6 plants in North America that are in construction now. But I think that's because for trees to airline fuels. Trees are the best source, really, for all kinds of reasons. But that is definitely going to grow. There's no other alternative to it. And lots of people don't like to kind of put it that stark, but that's how I see it. You've had your hand up a long time, sorry.
Well, I was interested in you were saying that you could use biofuels as a way to rejuvenate rural areas that are economically struggling right now. Could you go into detail about some of the mechanisms that would actually make sure that the development of biofuels would help the people there instead of just being an area where you grow the crops and owned by a corporation?
Well, the crops are grown in rural areas. So,
of course, yeah, but just that it would help the people living in those areas.
Well, right. I mentioned that, and this has been one of the things that has intrigued me for 20 years, the concept of biorefineries, which can be, and I've heard presidents talk in these terms, you can put a biorefinery anywhere there's raw materials to fuel it. So where they grow trees, they have a lot of biorefineries in the Midwest to use cornstarch or soybean oil to make those fuels. But anywhere where they have enough raw material to make a plant, as opposed to most of our infrastructure in the U.S. Is down on the Gulf Coast for petrol refineries, and there's a reason for that, right? That's where the oil is, and that's where the oil is shipped in. So they put the plants where they needed to. But so it's a very concentrated and been very important industry for America. But the rest of the country, wherever there are these materials that could be grown, you can have a plant. So what does that mean for rural communities? Well, I mentioned the pulp and paper industry, which is a pretty big industry in America. That's gone through some very hard times. A lot of plants have been shut. And areas like Maine, for example, with a lot of trees, a lot of poor people. And with these plants shutting down, there's, if you can imagine if you're a soul out there out in the boondocks where they used to work at the pulp and paper plant, and that shuts down, there just ain't many opportunities out there. And so, there are some federal government, and maybe this is what you were getting to, federal government tools for using to promote rural development. I was in charge of I was the Undersecretary for Rural Development for Bush, and that basically affects every aspect of rural life. We would fund hospitals and schools and fire stations and industry, you name it, putting money into it. So the Farm Bill is I mentioned that. They have a title in the Farm Bill called the energy title, and that has loan guarantees for plants, and people are using that, loans and grants. There's lots of R&D in the government, but and kind of going off of her question, at the end of the day, you've got to have a good management team. You got to have a good, sound business plan. You got to have the right supply chain, and you got to have the money behind you. So I think all those together, though. But wherever there are, it's kind of maybe what you're getting at is, why would you build it in a rural area?
Right.
Well, you build, kind of like the old adage in politics: the duck hunters go where the ducks are. You can't, like for trees, for example, you can't build these facilities, these manufacturing facilities, very far away. There's like a radius. You put your plant in the center, and about 50-mile radius is where you draw your raw materials in from. Because if you go, I think it's 50. But if you go much further than that, it's not economical because you have to haul that stuff in. There have been schemes to process it out in the field and ship the oil in. Usually doesn't work. But you have to center it where the raw material is. Sir?
Yeah, so I'm trying to parse out the difference between bioenergy and corn ethanol. Because I worked for...
It's part of it.
Yeah, so a former boss of mine was, served as the acting undersecretary at USDA, and she was involved with the Great Lakes Bioenergy Research Center. And the sort of message I got from her was that corn ethanol in that experiment, in terms of the land use, was inefficient and was sort of seen as a failure. Corn
Farmers
ethanol.
would disagree with you, but yeah.
Okay, so that was my understanding, and so
Yeah.
and it's from the conversations that I have with my boss, it seemed like it was harmful to the environment. I did hear sort of the food versus fuel debate, so I'm kind of wondering if you can help me parse out the differences
Sure.
between bioenergy and corn ethanol.
What part of USDA was she part
yeah,
of?
yeah, she was. I think it was science, maybe education.
Research education,
Yeah, science research
or
education.
RE as they call it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, as I mentioned at the start, you know, there has been an evolution of this. So corn starch ethanol, or fermenting cornstarch to make an alcohol, that's what it is, that then gets blended into gasoline. That was the start of bioenergy, really. I mean, if you take away just burning wood to heat houses, the modern bioenergy era. There have been two major pieces of legislation, the renewable fuel standard, which said it should be, I think, $7.5 billion, then it took it to 15 billion. It's capped. But you know, I'm not one of those who denigrates that. That is an essential part of the energy equation. Think about 15 billion gallons that we have to replace with oil if that wasn't there. But there's been kind of a change of thinking, and this is sort of the conflict I was referring to: big ag, big oil, and then there are people who are kind of neither one. Big ag is really corn ethanol. You know, you have processors like ADM and Bunge and the big global conglomerates using corn. But there began to be a change in thinking, and I mentioned the Biomass R&D Act of 2000. The thinking started to change around that point, and they said, you know, it's not really sustainable to use food-based materials, and we could talk about that a little bit more too, but something that's based on food, a food source, to make a fuel. We think it needs to be kind of the next generation, what some people refer to as advanced biofuels. That's sort of the second or third or fourth generation. So that's when they use things like algae, trees, garbage, human waste, or any animal waste. That's not a food source, obviously. The corn growers and the big ag industrial groups really bristle at that. But they're kind of protected in, but they are capped by law at 15 billion gallons because of some of this thinking. You know, this is a very long discussion, but they bristle at that. The corn growers bristle at it because not only do you make ethanol out of the process, you also make animal feed. And nobody ever really talks about that. They call it DDGs. Still grains, something still grains. So that's used for animal feed. Well, that's putting it back into the system. And it's really corn starch, you know, not corn oil. The corn oil is used to make, or corn syrup used to make a lot of other things. So it's not really using a food source, but it's taking it's kind of like cracking a barrel, kind of cracking the corn kernel to make they make all kinds of things out of corn. So, but that's where the political thinking has been since 2000. Bill Clinton pushed that, George Bush pushed that, and it's kind of, Mr. Obama didn't like it, period, but those two presidents were kind of the founders of it. And you have an association in town called the Advanced Biofuels Association, and they're looking at using things like cellulose or the lignin from trees. That's the thing that makes trees stand up straight. Very hard to break down chemically, but they're finding ways to do that, to make bio-based products. So, yeah, the food versus fuel thing was, see, in my mind, there these arguments pop up, and different academics will come up with their theories, and they kind of flame, you know, shoot out into the atmosphere like a firework. And eventually they get debunked, most of them, or all of them. So it's not really, I mean, another little story, back in the Bush era, when this was really rolling, the food versus fuel, we had the turkey growers, the chicken growers, the hog growers, the beef growers, all kinds of meat growers came storming into USDA to demand that we stop biofuels because it was hurting their business. But all the experts showed that what really is hurting their business was the rise of the price of oil. It kind of goes like this, in parallel. And that indeed, when oil fell, that's what happened. So, there are environmental, and I didn't want to miss this point too, I touched on it, but there's always a trade-off for an energy source. I don't think it can be debunked. There is no perfect energy source. You can name just about anything you can think of. Wind power, I'm digressing a little bit, but they first started with windmills, and they put them in the Altamont Pass in California and found out they were chopping up raptors, endangered bird species, because they put them right in the pathway of migratory birds. And it still continued to this day to be a problem. They have an issue with chopping up raptors. Nobody really knows why. There was a big offshore windmill that was going to be put off the shore of Massachusetts called Cape Cod Wind. They fought that, the developers fought the forces against them for about 10 years and failed. There were rich landowners like the Kennedys or Senator Warner from Virginia who owned land along the coast, and you could, that little bitty windmill out in the ocean was bothering their viewscape. So that was part of the reason they got killed. There was something in the press the other day. Georgetown University wants to chop down a bunch of trees in a small forest it owns to put in solar panels. It sounds like a good idea, right? Holy moly. There are a lot of environmental pushback on that, because do you really want to chop down trees that generate energy? They were just going to clear it and put in stationary solar panels. So, yeah, there are, and I've heard them. I've heard some of these meetings, like in Brazil, the Europeans would sit across the table from me and scream at us how bad biofuels are and how we have to restrict it. But then you think, well, what's the alternative to oil? And I kind of rest my case with that, and we all know what the bad things are with petroleum and coal. That's been obvious for years, but we still use a lot of it. So I guess part of the reason I wanted to go through it this way today was not just helping you see a picture of a massive industry, opportunities for you, but help you as voters and citizens too, because the press does a terrible job of explaining these kind of things. So do politicians of all stripes. They don't understand it most of the time, but these are very complicated topics. And so corn ethanol is still out there, and if it wasn't there, the agricultural sector in America would be really hurting big time. Again, it's bad news already right now, but that's why there is support. It's agricultural policy, but to my mind, it's not bad. They've just kind of set it at a certain level, and they said we're going to promote this other stuff, which I've spent most of my career supporting.
I want to pick up on one question that was asked earlier about the use of bioenergy to generate power. So a lot of these scenarios generated by the IPCC to reach less than 2 degrees centigrade or 1.5 include BECCS, bioenergy, and CCS. And I don't think a lot of people realize that many of those scenarios do assume that there's a widespread commercial deployment of BECCS. So I'm wondering if you, what your viewpoint of that is. Is there a role for bioenergy and CCS as
And CCS standing for carbon capture
and storage? Right.
Storage,
So it's,
right.
it's using plant-based products to trees absorb carbon,
Yeah.
use the plant-based trees to generate
It's a
power.
circular
and then you
argument.
capture the
Right.
carbon, so it's taking it out of the atmosphere. And
Right there is where a lot of environmentalists fall off the table, though.
True, although there are
use the
a
carbon
number
out.
of environmental organizations that support CCS. But
Yeah.
the bigger challenge is that this is not a widely commercial process, and yet it figures so prominently in many of the scenarios that tell us how we're going to get to certain emissions targets. I'm just wondering if in your discussions, in your travels, if you run across much commentary or discussion on this.
So
bioenergy CCS.
using biological materials to generate electricity and then storing the leftover carbon, is that what you're doing?
Capturing the carbon and storing it, yeah. So if instead of applying capture technology, CCS system to a fossil fuel plant, you apply it to a bioenergy plant.
I don't see a lot of that. I think they're, enormous. That sounds good in theory to me. You kind of bump up against this, you know, throughout careers. Like going back to your question, there's been a lot. I've heard so many people talking about using waste to energy, and they just never quite seem to pan out, you know, for one reason or another. And sometimes I just kind of scratch my head as to why it didn't work, because there clearly is a need. But this, I just don't see much of that happening out there. No, I think it's hard enough to get the fuels, the transportation, liquid fuels, and the bio-based product stuff off the ground. This kind of seems to me to have a lot more hurdles in the way.
Next level of
And plus,
compliance.
think about your competition. You're competing against solar and wind and fuel cell, stationary fuel cells, and whatever else you do to generate power, plus cheap gas, you know, which we have plentiful amounts right now. So it's just, yeah, I have a lot of trouble. I have a lot of trouble understanding that and accepting that.
It's discouraging to hear that, not your viewpoint, but that you don't see a role for that, because as I say, a lot of these scenarios assume that there will be a lot of this bioenergy in CCS. And if that's not something that we see being widely commercially deployed in the near future, then that takes, according to these scenarios, a huge arrow out of the quiver that's not available. But I agree with you. It seems like it's a next step of complexity. It's the same challenge with applying CCS to a coal-fired plant. This is a next step of complexity and cost. It doesn't make sense if you have cheap gas or you could be.
Well, plus you get back to basic economics too. What's the best use of a raw material? That's why I kind of bristle at the, you know, I don't make a big public campaign out of it, but bristle at the use of using trees to make wood pellets and shipping them by ocean shipping all the way to Europe to burn with coal. It just doesn't really make sense to me. I know it happens, but it's because of subsidies and regulations in Europe.
Right.
But what's the best use of that natural resource? And the market will tell you that. And you know, they are making fuels and they are making products. Products, by the way, bio-based products are a mega high value product. You can use small amounts of material and the profits are enormous. So that draws in.
So there's your case.
So yeah, I mean, does that what's the best use? A business person's going to look at that and say, you know, what can I make the most money off of? And it probably isn't electricity and carbon capture, unless there are massive subsidies by the U.S. government. Well, wait a minute, you've had S1. You've had your hand up down there.
You mentioned about algae.
Yes.
Can you elaborate more on your prospects and or like, I don't know, it depends on markets or like policies or oil prices or whatever.
Yes, it does. Depends a lot on the markets.
Do you see it like taking off soon? Algae as a source of biofuel?
Algae is another one of those things that's kind of gone up and down. You know, the U.S. government was backing it for a while, then they pulled way out of it, and then now they're backing it again in terms of research. There are a lot of little companies looking at this. I worked, the Algae Biomass Organization was one of my clients for a while. They need a lot of R&D still. They may need help from the government in terms of building that industry. It's not cost effective yet. I think it's one of those things that has a lot of promise, but not really sure if it'll ever get to the promised land or how it's going to get there. I mean, I don't think you should ever take it off the table because it is a possibility, and I wouldn't want to naysay that. But there have been, again, you know, companies have kind of flared up, they got famous, and they didn't quite make it. So you always have to be able to make it in the marketplace to whatever it is you're selling. So now what's happened is, in the algae industry, they've kind of shifted from focus on fuels, like liquid fuels, which they are very good at, but to making food supplements, and they're even better at that, you know, or cosmetic ingredients. And so in a world that is desperate for new sources of food and sustainable food, that's a real possibility. So they've kind of, and this has happened in the bioenergy industry too. There have been companies that found out they, at the time they were pursuing it, they couldn't quite make it, so they shifted their focus. Good business people do that. You know, where's another good market for my skills and my products? And they've shifted into nutraceuticals. You know, you can see sometimes in the, like organic stores, you can see milk with algae. they're not really sure yet how the public will accept that, so they play that down, you know. And having cows eat algae may change the chemistry inside a cow for dairy. So there's lots of work that still needs to be done, but I think it's more of a maybe third or fourth
People
generation.
eat kale, so I wouldn't eat algae.
And you can't use the algae, unfortunately, that's infesting the Great Lakes.
Well,
Nobody knows how to do that.
That's true.
I've
If you
heard
think about it-
politicians say, well, why can't we just use that to make fuels? Well, you know, no, we can't do it that way. Who hasn't asked a question that wants
Was
to?
there another question on this? Does that-
Okay.
He kind of has a question.
Okay. Okay.
So more broadly about emissions, I have two questions on that field. The first is about carbon accounting and
Mhm.
whether and how biofuels or bioenergy fits into carbon accounting, especially with the RED and RED Plus programs. And
I don't know anything about Red Plus.
My understanding of it is essentially that forests can count as like negative
Oh, yeah, okay,
emissions.
okay.
And then my second question is that these are still thermal processes, and I'm wondering about
Not entirely. There's chemical
tailpipe
processes,
emissions and particulate matter and airborne pollutants like that, and how it compares to traditional fuels.
Yeah. There's been a lot of work done, especially in Europe, on sustainability measurements. You know, how can you say to the public whether or not our product is sustainable? And of course, you talk to 10 economists and there's 15 opinions on that, about what is sustainability. But I think it's, you have to, as I mentioned, the Global Bioenergy Partnership, go on their website, GBEP's website. They developed a list of metrics you can use to then figure out, measure in environmental reasons, and for environmental purposes or social or economic. And that's probably one of them. It's the air quality. But I would again say, part of my beef sometimes with people who attack bioenergy is they look at one aspect of it. So I can't speak off my cuff about whether it's better than this or worse than that. Sometimes there have been, like diesel fuels had certain emissions. Biodiesel may have some of those too, but I think in general it's inarguable that it's more sustainable than fossil fuels. It's not perfect. It's not a perfect fuel. And there have been, and so the enemies of those, or opponents of those who want to stop bioenergy development will start to hone in on one aspect or another, or they'll say, this isn't sustainable for this reason. But I guess my whole argument as I'm trying to portray here today is, I think you have to look at a bigger picture than that. And if you really want to, forests are more tightly regulated than, say, corn. There's more emotion around forests than there is about other types of bioenergy. So yeah, they have sustainability. There's different groups that will do sustainability assessments, and that may be a part of it. But I think it's been demonstrated, like out in the ports in California, where they use advanced biodiesel, that's reduced the air pollution. That people have used diesel fuel, which we know what that is like. It has reduced, especially in poor communities around the ports. So these things do get, I'm not arguing with you, but I'm urging you as a citizen to kind of dig into that and, lay it all out. Because I think things like, that's what I argued when we set up the GBEP group was, follow the science, base it on facts, not emotion, and be very public about it, with the pluses and minuses, and let the public weigh in on it. I may not entirely address your question because I don't know all the specific technical details you're bringing in there, but it may be worse on some aspects, I'm sure it is, but better on many others. Yes, sir.
Yeah, so in your presentation, I think you mentioned the power of free markets and wanting to sort of get rid of some market distortion subsidies. And I think you mentioned electric vehicles, how there's a lot of subsidies for those. My understanding was that corn specifically and corn ethanol receive a lot of government subsidies. So how would that
That's a
compete
very
with
good
other
question.
fuel sources without, like, can corn compete in terms of a fuel source without subsidies, or is it?
If you're talking, I actually had that as one of my myths, and I was playing around with this, that it's totally reliant on subsidies and mandates. There used to be subsidies for ethanol. That went away years ago. They have a mandate now, the Renewable Fuel Standard says and they use things called RINs, Renewable Identification Numbers, to trade. It's like a trading market system. There is no subsidy for ethanol right now. There are subsidies for those who want to buy electric vehicles. And by the way, I won't get into this subject, but if you want to dig into sustainability of electric vehicles, it's really a fun topic to dig into, because you got to look at, like we're talking about, the whole chain of events. You know, the child labor in Africa, mining the stuff. You know, where it comes from, how it's used. Is it if electric vehicles are really coal-powered vehicles right now? And then something that is on the horizon that we haven't even addressed. Nobody knows. Nobody wants to address it because it's so unknowable. What do you do with the batteries? They're full of toxic waste, and as the world grows more with electric vehicles, we have more and more of these batteries that nobody really knows how to dispose of. So again, it's not to put it down, but you have to look at, you know, really dig into the facts, because the press isn't going to do it for you, and most politicians aren't. So yes, there is a mandate for ethanol, but it's capped at 15 billion. It's more of a mandate. Congress and the president said we want to push these advanced fuels, not corn ethanol.
Thank you.
So I'm going to ask the last question, because I know a number of us have to break for class at 2. So can we tie this back into the last myth? Bioenergy is irrelevant to SAIS. So where would you see the best fit in the bioenergy industry writ large? Are we looking at, obviously it's primarily a policy-oriented school program.
Right. But you train people to go into finance, like investment.
But people are taking corporate finance, project finance courses. People are taking geopolitics of energy. You know, I think there's some interest in project development as well. So there's lots of different angles to their interests and to their training. Do you see kind of some areas of obvious complementarity, like where in the industry writ large do you think they might best fit? Is it in obviously policy, marketing strategy for a company, and what sort of areas do you see in the industry writ large that might best fit?
Well, the first part of that answer is we're at the early stage yet. I have to posit that, and I think it's going to grow. So you can accept that or not. But it really depends. Excuse me. It really depends on the student, I think. What the interest is, and a SAIS background doesn't necessarily have to directly relate. I'm kind of a perfect example of that. You know, I think the grounding you get in understanding or learning how to think and to synthesize information is really critical. As I've been trying to lay out, this is a complicated field with lots of moving parts to it, and you know, people that can have been trained to think and write and express themselves. It's kind of an open field for running, I think. You might get more focused on, you know, the international lending organizations, which have been slow to pick up on this. Maybe financiers who may or may not be interested in this. But I think the green energy field in writ large, including this, is going to go nowhere but up. So maybe figure out what, maybe turning that on its head, I think, is, you know, the type of area you want to be involved in, the type of the region even. You know, it's so closely tied to food production in the developing world that, you know, sometimes you have to kind of turn your thinking around a little bit. That by building a modern agricultural sector, you can develop this. And so these things are so linked together, you can't break them out. But I think those are the areas, you know, in terms of geopolitics, SAIS super at that, teaching that. Understanding the food, agriculture, water nexus. That's, as our population of the world grows, it only becomes more important. You know, where are we going to get sources of food, and how do we encourage places to grow their own?
You know, that's good to hear, because that is something we try to impart, right? That there's an ecosystem and a network of all these linkages, right? It's not just about energy, not just about food, not just about water, but to think in a sort of systems way.
Yeah.
And all of these things are linked.
And that, you know, it is all linked, science and diplomacy and politics. I mean, you could go, you know, find a candidate you like and work with them. I mean, this might be a part of it, depending on what part of the country. Sometimes it's negative, sometimes it's positive. Miss AOC isn't very big on it, but other people are. Miss Klobuchar, Senator Klobuchar, is very big on bioenergy. She's a candidate for president. So it kind of depends on, you know, where your interests lie. Like, I wasn't very big on grammar. And I think you know, as for students, it's also where you start isn't where you're going to end up either. I mean, there's even in government, you can once you get in, you find places more of interest to you, and it may be only a side issue in what you're working on, but it's there. Energy, water, food, all these things, environment, they're there and they're growing in importance, and it comes to rest. That's part of my message today in a subject like this. So there's all kinds of different fields. You know, find a company you like. Neste out of Finland is a world leader in making advanced biofuels and advanced bioproducts. They're really big in trying to crack this plastic problem, which is only going to get bigger, maybe bigger than climate change. So, you know, where do you want to dig in, and then take it from there. I'd have to sit down with an individual and see what
Sure. No, I
what
appreciate
you really
that.
want to do.
That's good comments.
I'm just saying there are opportunities
Oh, absolutely.
out of the myths.
And I think just to close, and thank you for sharing your views on this. I mean, I think I said at the beginning that, you know, you and I agreed that this was a topic that needed more exposure at SAIS, and so I thought this was a good end to have somebody with your knowledge come in and talk about the subject broadly. So thank you very much for spending the time, and everybody, please thank
Well, thank you.